Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Theology Thursday. Today we are taking a break from our series Wrong. I'll talk about that in a second, but first let me introduce myself. I'm Pastor James Smith. I serve at St. John's Lutheran Church in Three Rivers, as well as serving as the rector of Trinity Episcopal Church in Three Rivers. I am joined by Pastor Chris Laughlin, via Lutheran Church Constantine. How are you doing today?
It's a beautiful day, Pastor James.
It is a beautiful day because today is the 490th birthday of the Augsburg Confession. Now, serendipitously, that is 70 times 7, which is a great biblical number. So I think there's a good ground for us to take a break from our series Wrong and discuss what we might call Right, the Augsburg Confession. I think we've said plenty of things about what we don't like. Now let's talk about what we do like more.
A true and faithful exposition of the scriptures.
Yeah, it's almost like you stole that line from somewhere.
Well, I learned it from Dr. Kleinhans, but I think she got it from somewhere else, yeah.
That's right. So why don't we start out today? We've got a lot to get to. We're going to try to get you the history, as well as some of our hot takes on a few of the controversial articles. So stay with us through the history for any heresy that one of us might accidentally sprout later on. It should be an exciting time. But Pastor, would you like to introduce for us what is an Augsburg Confession and why is an Augsburg Confession?
So I think first and most importantly, we talk about these documents, and I think sometimes they're scary, especially when you see me walking around with this giant blue book in my hand. We'll come back to the giant, yes, that one, the Book of Concord. We'll talk more about the Book of Concord in a couple of minutes, but it's important to know that the Augsburg Confession, it's not necessarily an intimidating giant book, right? This one sits by my bedside. This is sort of my travel version. Mm-hmm. It doesn't even have real binding, right? We're not talking about necessarily an intimidating document. It's not all that long. It's got a lot of richness to it, but it wasn't meant to be intimidating. It was meant simply to be a statement of faith and an understanding of how we understand the faith. So the Reformation's underway in 1517, just give you a quick timeline. 1517, Luther nails his theses to the door of the Catholic Church of Wittenberg. By 1521, 4 years later, Luther is an outlaw. He can be seen, stopped, killed on sight.
By anyone.
By anyone, yeah. Perfectly lawful. He's kidnapped by his own people. He's taken to the Wartburg. He translates the Bible, but there are lots of things going on politically, geographically, socially in Germany where Luther lives at this time. The guy in charge, Emperor Charles V.
Boo.
Yes, boo! Historically, boo.
Boo this man.
To his west, he's in conflict with France. To his east, he's in conflict with the Ottoman Empire. And he is not necessarily a great guy. He's not a great ruler. And remember that for them in this time and place, there's not a whole lot of division. There's a lot of interweaving between church and state. And Luther will have some things to say about that, but I don't think we'll get there a little bit today, but not a whole lot.
His very title is Holy Roman Emperor, and even though he's in Germany, but yeah. And I think it's also worth pointing out that as long as we're at it, why he was not so great. I think one reason is he took over when he was very young. I forget what age he is, but this kind of falls upon him by a bunch of German electors an interest in picking someone who's not going to be a threat to them. So it's kind of like if we were to vote today instead for the lesser of two evils, for the greatest of two evils, like who is going to be the least potent against us? So, and then this huge crisis falls into his lap. But why don't you continue?
So, well, and he's elected, but it's not like an election today, right?
No.
however many it is, nobles get together, and there's a relatively limited pool of possibilities. And while they didn't want him to be trouble for them, he winds up being trouble for them because he tries to consolidate power away from them. And one of the things he hopes to accomplish, much like the Emperor Constantine before him, is to sort of sweep aside theological differences and consolidate the church back under imperial rule in a lot of ways. So he invites orders. He calls for an imperial diet in the city of Augsburg, in German, in Latin, Augustana. That'll be important in a minute.
And not a diet like the Atkins or the keto or Burger King.
No, yes, not a good or bad diet, an assembly.
Yep.
Much like I think the Japanese parliament is called diet, is it not?
Beyond my pay grade, sorry.
Fair enough. Anyway, so this is a diet like an assembly. And the Lutherans who are called together, first of all, Luther can't go. So his buddy, or his prince, Elector John of Saxony, yes, Elector John, commissions his theologians led by Luther, and Luther's buddy's name is Philip Melanchthon. And so Luther can't go, so he sends Melanchthon in his stead to speak on behalf of the Lutheran, although that word is not really a word yet, so much as evangelisch, evangelical, Protestant. Pardon me, the evangelical Protestant eventually Lutheran theologians are sent to present their side. And they're under the impression, as I understand it, that the Roman Catholic theologians will present their side and they'll have a conversation. This is not what happens. The Lutheran theologians present their side, and the Catholic theologians take it, and they run into the back, and they write what's called the Confutation, disputing the Augsburg Confession. And then afterwards, Melanchthon will write a defense of the Augsburg Confession, or a defense, as we generally call it now, the apology. But not like, I'm sorry I wrote this. More like, I wrote this
because... Sorry, you're wrong.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you're wrong.
Yeah, and so...
Hashtag sorry, not sorry.
So all that, the presentation of the Augsburg Confession happened 490 years ago today, June 25th, 1530. It's a date, it's at least on the Missouri Synod and Wisconsin Synod calendar. Big deal. I'm not sure if it's on the ELCA calendar or not. It was considered a holy moment at the time. If you watch the, as my wife calls it, the movie with the hot Luther that came out in the early 2000s, he describes this moment as Satan invites us to preach in hell, which is kind of, I think there's a question, maybe they were hopeful they'd actually get some good back and forth, but I think it was at least an example or an opportunity to present their side of here's systematically what we believe, rather than just, they've basically been going at each other through pamphlets and sermons for the both points. So this is more systematic. There's a legend, who knows if it's true, that when they read it out loud, the voice carried out into the surrounding streets of Augsburg, and, it would be a pretty cool thing to see.
It would have. I would like to point out, Luther didn't write this, and that, I think that matters for a number of reasons. By now, we do have the Large and Small Catechism. They're out and in circulation by 1530. They're written in 1528, 1529. Luther wrote those. Luther did not write the Augsburg Confession. If you read what Luther writes, he's not a really good systematician. He's really good at answering practical questions based on actual things that happen. Yeah. But he's not a fabulous systematic theologian. That's Melanchthon's job. Melanchthon's much better at that. And so Melanchthon writes the Augsburg Confession and the Apology of the Augsburg Confession. And they're trying to get across the point that they're not really doing anything new or different or radical. Right? They see themselves as a continuation of what will later become what will later come to be called the primitive church. They will cite the church fathers, they will cite scripture, and they will say, this is not new. We are getting back to the way things were, the way things should be, that it is the church today, i.e. the church in 1530, which has diverged from the true path. We are calling them back to reform.
That's a great point. And I would say you can see this in their terminology too. When we say Catholic, we often mean the church under the Pope. They would have considered themselves the Catholic Church. They would say they are the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church from Nicaea. And whenever they refer to those in league with the Pope, they refer to it as the Roman Church. And they're trying, I think one thing I want to point out is also trying to say that they are loyal subjects of the emperor. So if you read the preface and you're not used to 1500s sucking up to people above you, you'll be kind of blown away by how they suck up. It's like, to the most invincible, who knew you could be more or less invincible in the Greeks, but to the most invincible by the grace of God, or, you know, whatever. It just is interesting because they have to know this is not going to work, but, you know, they're trying to show we are good subjects, we are good Catholics, we are good Christians. It's actually the Pope and his cronies that you have to beware of.
And we don't know whether they were acting in good faith or not. Like, what were they thinking when they were going in that day? We will never know. But you're right. Most serene, most mighty, invincible emperor, most gracious lord. A short time ago, your imperial majesty graciously summoned an imperial diet to convene here in Augsburg. The summons indicated an earnest desire, first, to deliberate concerning matters pertaining to, quote, the Turks, that hereditary foe of ours and of the Christian name. Right? And they go on. But whether or not they think he's sincere, they have to act like it, right?
That's exactly right.
At your word, and then use your own words against you.
Yeah, perfect.
And I think it's important to point out, right? So we're saying this in English. We take the word Augsburg out of the German. In Latin, it's the city is Augustana, and so it's Confessio Augustana, the Augsburg Confession, which we then abbreviate CA, Confessio Augustana. It's not AC, Augsburg Confession, because there will be another abbreviation, AC, and I forget what it is now, and it wasn't air conditioning at the time.
Oh, shoot.
Yeah, I forget now. I should have written it down in my notes, but I didn't. So anyway, when we refer to the Augustana article, or when we refer to CA article, that's all the same thing. It's the Augsburg Confession, just shorthand. Now, it's also important to note that there were, in fact, two translations of the Augsburg Confession, even at the time. There was
neither was in King James English.
And neither was in King James English. No, there was Charles V German, even though I think Charles V was Spanish. And there was Latin, right? So it was written in medieval German and then ecclesial Latin. And I once had it described to me, and I'm just, anytime I refer to most of this stuff, it's probably going to be things I was taught by Dr. Kit Kleinhans. I knew her before she was famous. If it's anybody else, I'll cite that person specifically, but for the most part, it's Dr. Kleinhans. She used to talk about how when she knew preachers who preached in two languages, what's that word? Not bivocational. I hate that word.
Bilingual?
Bilingual. Thank you very much. When she knew bilingual preachers, they wouldn't always say necessarily the exact same thing in those two languages, because the two languages are just fundamentally different. Right? So sometimes the Latin text and the German text seem to differ. And so I think if you come from a more German strand of Lutheranism, then the German text holds primacy. And if you come from a not German strand of Lutheranism, then German text does not hold primacy. That's generally what I have discovered. It does seem to me as though the standard text and standard translation comes out of that book you were holding up a minute ago, that these texts, these translations are an older, I think these are both Tappert, the translation before the one you're holding. That's the Kolb-Wengert edition.
And could I point out something?
Sure.
So the thing this does that I like is, A, holy footnotes Batman, so that's always good. That help you through a lot of the translations. But on the left, you've got the English translation of the German text, and then on the right, you have the English translation of the Latin text. So you can see the differences between the two, and whichever one you like better to make your argument.
There's also, if you speak, or if you can read medieval German and Latin, there's the Triglotta, but we won't go there.
Yeah.
Because I don't read those languages. It's my understanding then that that translation that you hold up is the standard, right? If you're reading an English translation, it's that one. That one was a collaboration between the ELCA and the Missouri Synod. Though if you talk to preachers, Lutheran pastors who came out of seminary before about 2000, they're going to refer to the old Tappert translation. In fact, when Dr. Kleinhans taught this class, she would have Tappert on her desk, and she would refer to Tappert first, and then she would find what she was talking about in the Cope-Wengert edition.
Could I point out a difference between the languages? So I think you made a really good point about ecclesial Latin earlier versus German. So Latin is what the church is used to talking in. So I think you get a lot more technical theological terms in Latin, and in German, a lot of this is, I mean, Luther's Bible is actually a huge mile marker towards getting a written version of German at all, and that's 5 years before this comes out. So I think the Latin is a lot more technical, but you can see why if you're trying to go for some kind of mass appeal, putting it in German makes a lot of sense. Like, I mean, you know, you don't want to embarrass the princes or anyone in their court if their Latin's not quite up to snuff. You know, you can give it to them in the good old Deutsch.
Oh, and they'll do that again, right, with the Solid Declaration and the Epitome. A conversation for another time. Sorry, there's a final document of the Book of Concord. We'll come to that in a couple minutes. And when you and I talk about the articles of the Augsburg Confession, they're numbered. The Augsburg Confession is broken down into articles. First of all, those articles are not original. When they wrote this document, they just wrote it down, right? It was like the Bible. When Paul wrote a letter, he just wrote a letter. We added the chapters and verses. Well, the chapters first, and then a couple hundred years later, the verses. That's why Luther doesn't refer to verses, because he didn't have them. Well, we did the same thing with the Augsburg Confession. We divided it into articles and what we think of as logical divisions. I think for the most part, they are logical divisions.
Yeah, I think it's easier than dividing parts of the Bible, personally. Because they have these tell markers that you'll get used to if you read it. It'll be like, concerning so-and-so they teach, or likewise they teach, and every time it's introducing a new subject. So I think, you know, in the Bible, sometimes you'll see chapter or verse markings or paragraph markings. All that's not in there too, that you can kind of debate. I think here it's pretty clear the differences.
I agree, but there was one major division which they did have in the original text, and that was the first part was the chief articles of faith, and the second part, those are articles 1 through 21, and the second part is articles in which an account is given of the abuses that have been corrected.
Right. Yeah, it's a lot. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say that last part is not only more contentious, but it's the rubber hits the road during the Mass or the Lutheran Divine Service, how you want to say. So those last 8 articles, or whatever they're numbered, are more about practical things that you would see walking into a church, that if you're used to the same Roman Mass for, you know, hundreds of years, it has been pretty much standardized from place to place, at least, that you'll notice here, this is a difference, and here's why we felt we had to correct that.
And those articles are on the whole longer.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's almost like the first 2/3 they're trying to show, here is how we are good Catholic Christians, just like all of you, and then it's kind of here's where we think you're wrong.
In practice, yeah. It does, getting back to our series, because this is kind of an excursus, but kind of not, because, right. Or it's kind of a sidetrack, but kind of not, because each article ends with rejected therefore, or in the Latin, condemned therefore. So as we discussed, rejected therefore are all the heresies that are opposed to this article. I'm reading the first article. Such as the Manichaeans, who posited two gods, one good and one evil, the Valentinians, the Arians, the Eunomians. I'll stop there because it gets a little confusing after that. Because go ahead.
But hopefully you recognize some of those names if you stuck with our video chats for the last few weeks.
And if not, just go back and watch last week and the week before.
That's right.
And then it becomes important. This becomes super important for a couple of reasons. I don't know how much what the reformers knew of what was coming. I mean, nobody can see the future, but the Augsburg Confession then becomes foundational to what Lutherans say they believe. And so the Augsburg Confession, the Apology of the Augsburg, I'm sorry, I have to do it by author, right? So it's the Augsburg Confession, the Apology of the Augsburg Confession, and then Melanchthon wrote a treatise called The Treatise on the Power and the Primacy of the Pope. We might talk about that someday, we might not, but it's in there.
It's too hot to handle, really. It's a hot potato, a hot theological potato.
There are three documents written by Luther: the small catechism, the large catechism, and the small card articles, which will be similar to the Augsburg Confession, except that Luther wrote it, so it's much less systematic.
And much more offensive.
Say again?
And much more offensive.
Yeah, I was going to say much angrier.
Yeah, that's better. Melanchthon he's always more diplomatic. Luther's a man of the people.
And can be somewhat prude, and yeah, he's not afraid to pull any punches, shall we say? Right. And by the time he writes the small card articles, he's old and cranky. So those are the three documents by Luther: the small catechism, the large catechism, the small card articles. By the time the small card articles are written, the Lutherans are starting to ask themselves questions like, how many times do we have to write down what we believe? So they take the three chief symbols or creeds: the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and the Athanasian Creed, as we discussed previously. So now we're up to 9 documents, and then they had to iron out some arguments among themselves. And then so they wrote a document called the Formula of Concord, and because they were getting into some technicalities, and there's some important stuff in there. Please don't misunderstand me. And they write 2 versions of that, one for the theologians and one for the stupid princes: the Solid Declaration and the Epitome. And those 10 documents combined then in 1580, because the formula is 1577, and in 1580 we published the Book of Concord. Yes.
Yep. This one's only 10 years old, though, with that.
Lutheran pastors, and I don't know about the other roster, but I assume since we now roster deacons, they also promise to teach and preach in accordance with the scriptures, the creeds, and the Lutheran confessions. I tend to focus my study on the small catechism, the large catechism, and the Augsburg Confession, but I do reference back to and read and occasionally study, though less devotionally, the other documents.
And let me say that the Augsburg Confession among these has primacy, though. I'm trying to remember if it's a church in Sweden or Finland does not actually accept all of Formula Concord, which is the part at the end. But every Lutheran church, what it means to be a Lutheran church is you accept the Augsburg Confession. So if you're really motivated and you want to go look at your congregation's constitution, one of the first articles in there that is mandated for every ELCA constitution is that we accept the unaltered version of the Augsburg Confession. And I don't think we need to get into altered or unaltered right now.
That's fine.
We can touch on it when we get to the Lord's Supper, maybe. But that is considered a requirement. So, yeah, it's. I think we know the small catechism more because many of us took confirmation and that was the thing we learned. But this is kind of the whole game right here is the Augsburg Confession.
But I think all Lutheran denominations accept the small and large catechism as well as the Augsburg Confession.
Yeah, but Yeah, but it's not as technical, I guess, or as precise as the Augsburg Confession. It doesn't answer all the questions that may arise. I mean, neither does the Augsburg Confession, frankly, but it answers more questions. And again, Luther's not as careful a writer as Melanchthon is. So I think especially like on the Lord's Supper, for instance, or the Sacrament of the Altar, as it's called in the Small Catechism, uh, there are different ways to read that. From I think Augsburg's a lot clearer on the Lutheran understanding.
Fair enough.